Welcome back for another book review. Today we are talking about this one. So this is a brief guide to Celtic myths and legends, and I don't really know how to say this author's name. To me, it looks like it would be pronounced Martyn, but it's with a Y, so I'm assuming the Y takes on the I letter pronunciation, but I don't know. And the last name is Whittock, I think. Again, could be totally wrong. So I decided that I wanted to know a little bit more about some of the Celtic mythology, and I was hoping for a book that would describe that to me because it's kind of complicated and like I don't really know it terribly well. It gets really complicated very quick because like some of them overlap between like Irish and Welsh, and like there's some that don't, and then it's very confusing, especially as somebody who never really learned it. Like, again, we don't know a whole lot about, like, okay, at least in my schooling, we never really learned a whole lot of, like, those myths. We learned Greek and Egyptian. Those are the ones that we learned in school, that we were taught, and so to try and learn a different one is always a little more challenging. So I was hoping this would help, because a lot of the pagan books will talk about these deities and like they mention certain things, but they never really explain it. So I was hoping this book was going to do that. I was also like, I know you shouldn't do this, but I had the hope that this would kind of present it more along the lines of Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman, where it's how I personally think that more of the myths should be told in a story sense, because I'm sure that's how the ancestors told it. There's no way the elaborate stories of these myths were told in such a bland way. Like, you know that, like, they had to have told it in, like, such a captivating way. And it might not be captivating to nowadays, like, audience, but at some point, like, they would have sat around a fire and told these stories, you know? And, like, that isn't how this book is at all. In fact, I left with, like, a little bit more knowledge, but like also really more confused. So yeah, this book, again, I had hopes that it was going to go through the myths. It did, but didn't simultaneously. Like, again, Neil Gaiman lays it out. He makes it so it's kind of a concise story-ish. They're at least grouped into stories together to like tell a story. This isn't. Like, each chapter kind of has a focus, kind of, and then like they'll have like these little like subheadings in the chapters to go over different things that are kind of related to that chapter. But like it kind of goes off the assumption that like you are from this region of the world, so you have a vague idea of the history and like the locations of things, and I don't. And so that kind of sucked because I'm like really lost and confused and like I don't know a lot about over there. So like I feel as if you would need to have like some preliminary knowledge before jumping in, and like there's like this assumption that like you kind of already have a vague idea of the myths in some ways because it's not actually told. When these myths are told to you, it's very like just a brief summary, and like it isn't making the myth come to life. It isn't telling you much of anything. It's so like summarized and really boring. And like, again, that's why I've never really loved mythology until I got to Neil Gaiman, because most of the time, as much as like I have issue with the pagan authors, they make the stories at least somewhat interesting. This author doesn't even try to do that. It's very bland, it's very... And like, throughout the entire thing, it's constantly an analysis, so you don't even get the story without analysis shoved in the middle of it, which kind of breaks whatever story you could be trying to follow along to, really. Because then it's like, oh, but in this book, and then this book, and then this book, and then in this text, and then by here, and this text is from this time, and this author, and this is what we think about this author, and it's like, I don't know that I care, dude. Like, just tell me the story first. Then go into these analytics. And I don't really care about that much. And honestly, I left just about as confused. There was only a few points in here that was like, interesting. Because like, honestly, it felt like the second half of this book was just like, mostly Arthur and the legend of Arthur. And like, is he real? Is he not? Let's go back to him. Pretty consistently. So I was like, okay. And like, some of the stories like really didn't line up. Like, I think it's pronounced Paul, but it's like spelled really weird. It's the guy that the goddess Rhiannon eventually marries. He's the one chasing her. But like then he's also in these other stories, and it just was like, but how does that, is it like the same dude? Is it different? Like it felt very confusing. And again, with the constant analysis in it, personally, I was really bored reading through this. So it was like, oh my God, just get to the point. Like, just tell me the story. That's all I was really here for. Didn't get anywhere with that. And it was just, I don't know. I just was constantly confused. And like, I don't know these myths, so that didn't help things either. Again, I know I shouldn't pit books against each other. I just was hoping for something a little better. Again, even Neil Gaiman, he has a chapter literally called The Players to introduce you to who the characters are going to be. Because like, you might not know them, and you might not know the world and the context and things, and so he talks about it. This didn't really have that. I wish it had. I wish it had something like that. And like, it kind of does, but it kind of doesn't. Like, it doesn't really explain a lot, despite being a decent-sized book. I was really lost and confused, and again, the analysis of it was really boring. And again, like, this isn't necessarily on the author, but there was such an emphasis on everything was changed with Christianity, to the point that I'm like, so why should we care? How do modern pagans look at these myths? Because constantly it's like, oh, but you could see like how the Christian influence hit. Like, there was like, well, it's based after Noah. And you're like, great, love that. And that this character has become similar to this character from like the Bible. And it's like, the comparison with Christianity, I know, is very like intertwined into the history because that's who it was written down by. But it just got really old. And it's like, okay, so how much of this should we even be listening to? Really? Like, it left me going, so what's the point in even trying with these gods at all? Because there's nothing here to really go off of. It's just based off of like some old Christian dudes who tried to make the stories match into the world they wanted it to. What's the point? And like, if we're gonna have a romanticized look at these old gods, I would probably kind of go with the more modern take, where like we also have a fantastical look at the past that isn't based much on history and like at all, because like at least it's from a pagan context versus a Christian context. And like, I know that's very, very much the thing here. Also, I mean, I did learn some things from this book. I just ended up with more questions. For instance, this book kind of pits it that like a lot of Europe counts as Celtic, so didn't know that was a thing, which probably is my own ignorance. Like, I didn't really ever think of like Spain when I think of Celts, and like France and Germany. I kind of didn't really think about that much. I could give more of like maybe France and Germany, but like Spain was just like a curveball in that. And like the only part of this book that like, because like it throws those out and then immediately it's like randomly we'll have like a French like random source, but then it's all supposedly like just based in like the UK, like Welsh, Irish, and I think there was like a little bit of Scottish-ish. Like it was kind of a mess. I can't say that I learned a whole lot from this, other than like Irish mythology is like the most kind of concise that you could kind of follow along with, kind of-ish. And that was about it. The only thing that I found kind of intriguing from this that I didn't know, but like kind of makes sense, was that I think it was, oh, I don't know how to say it. It's the people that came before the tribe of gods in Ireland. Like the formidable something, I know I'm saying it wrong, but the OG of the gods of Ireland. He mentioned it very, very briefly, which is a bummer, because I'm like, why are we not like talking about that more? That's kind of like, I've never seen that talked about before. It was a telling of how a Viking settlement had come to Ireland, and then they were the old gods, and then they got taken over by the new gods of the Irish people, which would be the Tuatha-De-Danann, which I know I'm mispronouncing. Those ones? The people of Danu. And that group of gods. And like, it's kind of intriguing to think of like, okay, so is it like the Norse gods were there initially and then like the Celtic gods, like the Irish Celtic gods came in? That's kind of an interesting take. Hadn't come across that one before. That's kind of cool. Did it go into anything further? Absolutely not. It was like 2 sentences, and it was like, but I would love to learn more about that. Like, I'm very curious. And it'd just be like these random little toss-outs of like, oh, well, we know like the Vikings came over and they influenced these areas, and you can tell by like some of the names, and then that's it. And it's like, but we could talk about that more. That's kind of interesting. Cause like, what? So moral of the story, this book just left me more confused. Like, again, the Irish thing was interesting, but other than that, like, obviously this is not written for people that aren't looking at this outside of an academic sense. Like, this is just for academic people. And like, if you're looking for this book to tell you more about the gods, I don't really think it does much for it, honestly. I mean, if you have a baseline knowledge, maybe, and you want to analyze the myths, maybe. But again, for being like a beginner guide, absolutely not. Like, I feel like you're going to be more lost and confused, because also, and maybe this is my Americanism showing, the names are kind of hard to follow because it is not our language. So it's like, you're looking at these words and it's similar to when you look up other ones too, because it's not names we're familiar with. And I think had you grown up there, it would be different. You might have heard these names before, but you don't hear. Like, you don't really hear a whole lot about like MacLear, because that's every time how my brain wants to read it. I know that's not how it's pronounced, but that's what it looks like, because it's just like da 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 da. Like, these names are strange. Like, and they're spelled so weird. Like, again, I'm pretty sure Paul is pronounced Paul. That's how I've seen it described to be pronounced online. But it's like P-W-Y-E-L or something like that. I don't even know if the E's in there. It might not even have an E. But like, it's a strange spelling. And like, it's an old language. Cool. Could we like just, I don't know, I feel like we could have explained things better in this book for people that are not familiar with this. Because we're not usually, like, we're more familiar with Greek and sometimes Egyptian. And then like you get into some of these other ones and it's like, when you learn about like the Norse, it's like, it's kind of complex because the names and the words kind of look like you whacked a keyboard, because it's not remotely close to like the same base language, which is fine. But again, having a little bit of like a slow introduction. Who are the players? What's the context? I don't really have that. This is just, again, I think it's a book that's more aimed at people who already live there, who know the general regions, they have a baseline history, they have a little bit of knowledge on the stuff, and it's just exploring it further for people who grew up there. Because again, I just feel like as an outsider reading this, you're like, I don't know what's going on. Like, and again, maybe it's just me. Mythology has always been kind of hard for me. And it really wasn't until I got into the Norse that, like, the myths kind of came to life. And this is, like, a really good reminiscent of, like, why I don't like mythology. Because it's like, what's the point? Why should a modern pagan care about these myths that are written down by Christians that totally changed it a lot for the sake of changing it to fit their narrative? That just, why do we care? Why do we care? And then you get to, like, the modern pagan books that are, like, equally just changing it up to fit their narrative, but their narrative's more fun. So it's like, do I care about the historical context? Because the historical context kind of is stupid anyways. Like, again, it's changed to specifically fit a Christian narrative, so why do I care? If I'm gonna have it changed, why not have it fit to like a more feminist change? Because like a lot of the like modern pagan looks at it, like we really twist it a different way. Like, you know, take Persephone. She was kidnapped, and the modern thing is that she was seeking her own independence. We reanalyze these myths. I'm kind of leaning towards liking the modern ones over this, but I have another Celtic book that I'm going to be reading that I think is going to be better than this. I actually have it right behind me. This one. I'm hoping this is going to be better. Again, granted, this is just on the one goddess. It's about Caradwen, which she wasn't a big player in this. And I'm hoping this might be a little better. I hope it might give some more information. Like, at least context clues wise. But overall, again, I feel like you need either more background knowledge before jumping into this, or if you lived there somewhere in the UK and you've heard these stories, you've heard of these gods, might be easier, but if you're like someone like me who's from America, this was not like a thing we talked about often, we learned about other pantheons, it might not be that helpful of a book. So anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts and recommended readings for this mythology in the comments down below. Huge thank you to my patrons. I'll have their names over here. If you would like to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/nightwillowcrafts. Make sure to check out my own witchy book. It is available, linked always from my blog down below. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and blessed be.